cloistered. The idea of apostolic religious women is a fairly late development in the history of the church. All of this comes from this kind of need to hang on that is clericalism. And the vision today is just as strong. It is just as powerful. It begins, and sometimes it becomes more powerful because as it begins to break down, you kind of hang on to it all the tighter. You see it, I think the need for clerical control is part of what leads to the investigation, not really investigation, the movement into the religious women's orders. It is a way of controlling because they are somehow independent of us. And we need to be the ones through whom all truth comes. There's a line in Kierkegaard that I can't help thinking of talking about this kind of despair. Kierkegaard says, admiration is happy self-surrender. Envy is unhappy self-assertion. Admiration is happy self-surrender. Envy is unhappy self-assertion. You see in a lot of these religious women, especially, even as they grow older and sort of are moving out of, in some ways, moving out of places of power, you see this kind of admiration for what is coming behind them. You see very much in the people who want to punish them and control them a kind of envy, in my opinion. And then along comes the sexual abuse crisis. Or along comes the realization that there's a sexual abuse crisis. And the governance crisis. The notion of abuse, even beyond sexual abuse, has long existed in the church. Because the structure itself, insofar as it was clericalist, led to priests becoming power brokers, which is both corrupting in itself and potentially dangerous to others. If you feel you have power, you can become sort of a self-exempting narcissist. And trust me, some of the people, even in our own generations that we've come to light, some of these men suffered from terrible narcissism. They believed themselves to be self-exempting because of the important things they were doing. And these men, not all narcissists become abusers, but several of the abusers were in fact narcissists. Or if you recognize that you don't have the power you're supposed to have, you can despair and you can become self-destructive, and in that sometimes destructive of others. This whole notion, this crisis, the crisis that really, I've often said that the abuse, the physical abuse, was horrible and a tragedy, but it becomes a scandal when it becomes an abuse of power through the cover-ups that happen. That's where the scandal for the church truly comes, the crisis in governance. And the crisis in governance comes because of the need to hold on to this idea of clerical caste. That the clerical caste is impervious to sin and failure. We must protect the church, which in an odd way becomes we must protect ourselves. And so everyone is jettisoned for the protection of the church. If you look at it, the victims are jettisoned. Their families are jettisoned. The parishes are jettisoned. Eventually, the priests are jettisoned, and the religious communities are jettisoned. And it's all in the name of protecting the church. There's a famous story about when Cardinal Law returned he left to go to Rome just at the time when the whole crisis broke. And he came back and he met with his priest, and his priest said, "How could you leave us just when this was about to hit the papers, when we were about to be kind of crucified by this?" And he goes, "I didn't leave you. Wherever the bishop is, there is the church." Which is a quote from Ignatius of Antioch, who used it in a very different way. He was on his way to be handed to the lions. But that's a whole different thing. That has not happened to Cardinal Law. You have more hopes for Francis than I have. But you see this reclericalization of the church, and I don't want to impugn on everyone who is clerical motives of evil. It is rather often a defensive position. It's a posture of fear. It leads to bad things in the church, but not necessarily malicious things. So you see a reclericalization coming into the church among many of those who follow this crisis, because they feel like the problem was not that we were too clerical. The problem was that because of course it all comes out as things become more liberal. So the thing we need to do is return to a kind of rigid clericalism. And so you see many people who have, many younger men who feel persecuted and attacked. They want to become more clerical. They want to move into a smaller group. They want to set themselves apart from the laity. And the reclericalization of the church is part of has been going on in the last few years. The other thing that's been going on, and I think is important, and I know I'm yammering on too long, but I haven't gotten to Francis yet. But the other thing, it's just important to know this context of where Francis comes in, is the reassessment of Vatican II. And there is an entire move, and it often comes under the language of saying that we want to show that Vatican II is continuous with prior councils, that it is continuous with Trent, that it is not something new. And I think of that recently, when Pope Francis's interview in the America magazine came out. I remember getting 3 days after it came out, finally they figured they had to respond, and a letter came out from I think the USCCB wrote it, and it came out from the bishop's office, and it said, you should read the wonderful interview by Pope Francis. You should note that everything he says is continuous with the teachings of Benedict XVI and John Paul II. And I read that and I thought, why should I note that? Why is it important why would I ever think, unless someone would doubt that, why would I think that? Why would I have to note that? I mean, can you imagine a letter coming out saying, John Paul II came out with a teaching, an encyclical today. Please note that his teaching is continuous with Paul VI and John the 23rd. You can't imagine a letter like that. But there's a split that's happening, a strain that is happening in the church, because there is something new happening here. The movement to portray Vatican II as continuous has become a move to underplay the highlighting of the role of the laity, to downplay things like, and you see this retrenchment through things like, again, the synods would be a highlight of that, even to downplay the idea of collegiality. The synods were originally created so that the bishops and the Pope would be in conversation with each other, so that they were conceived to be models, not of democracy. They weren't going to take a vote as to where the church should go, but it was meant to be a model of discernment, in which there would be voices that the bishops meeting together, including the Bishop of Rome, meeting together, would be able to understand and better move in the history of the church. Gradually, those were rolled back, so that eventually what happened is the whole plan of the synod would come out of the curial bureaucracy. Essentially, the documents would be pre-written to be approved at meetings. And what it became was much more the bishops getting their marching orders than it was the bishops contributing or challenging or differentiating. There wasn't the sense of debate. So the idea that the Pope today is having these two parts of the synod, the first one to say, what's the state of the question? In case you didn't know this, the Synod on the Families has two parts. And the 2014 meeting is to say, what's the state of the question? And the 2015 one is to say, and what should we do about it? The fact that Pope Francis has said things like, not every question has to be answered by the papal magisterium. There are people reeling from this. It is a different movement. And it's really moving against where the thinking of the church had been. One of my, two of my favorite moments, and he says ironically, had been a few years ago. I was sitting with a bishop and several bishops, and one of them said, these people came to see me and they said they wanted to represent the people of God. Well, I said to them, you're the people of God if I say you're the people of God. Which demonstrates both a very odd interpretation of baptism, But a striking ignorance, or at least a rethinking of Vatican II. That the people of God do not get their identity as the people of God from the hierarchy. The hierarchy gets its identity from the people of God. And that's what Vatican II does. And that's what Vatican II has been. And that's the challenge of allowing Vatican II to sort of sink in. The other thing that was fascinating to me is, I think it was 2 weeks or 3 weeks before Francis was elected. Does anyone know Robert Barron? He did the Catholicism series, which actually is a really, in many parts, a very good series. He's the rector at Mundelein. Well, he came out with an article that was published in Seattle newspaper, the Seattle Catholic newspaper, when we had one. We don't have one anymore. In which he talks about Vatican II as the world's largest meeting. The world's largest meeting. And he says, now the meetings are over, you don't want everything to be about a meeting. And he used this line right at the very end of his essay was this: listening, dialoguing, wondering, doubting, and discussing were all appropriate during a conciliar meeting. But those activities were not necessarily helpful in the actual accomplishment of the Church's mission of declaring the Lordship of Jesus. Just listen to that again. Listening, dialoguing, wondering, doubting, and discussing were all appropriate during a conciliar meeting. But those activities were not necessarily helpful in the actual accomplishment of the Church's mission of declaring the Lordship of Jesus. I actually thought those were the Church's mission. But you see that this is a position that says Vatican II is okay, but we have to stop it. We have to stop all this talking about things and discussing them. We have to move on now and proclaim the gospel. Proclaim the gospel in the sense of, oftentimes, proclaim the catechism. And the enshrinement of the catechism in many quarters has been an idea that some people have spoken of the catechism as the last conciliar document, because it is the fulfillment of the council. It gives all the rules. And all you have to do now is plug in the situation. Into this world comes Francis. And I'm just going to give 3 very brief moments. There's so much I could say about Francis. I mean, there's so many quotes. Actually, Francis says it much better than I do about anything he would say. The first thing I would want to point out, though, is what Francis comes in with, and this is actually a quote from a book of his before he was Pope, after he had come back from the conclave that elected Benedict, in which he was the second most votes, and in fact gave his votes, pushed his votes to vote for Benedict, if you believe the gossip, because of course everything that happens in a conflict is absolutely secret, which means it takes a week to get out. So I have to think, and the other thing about Benedict, by the way, sometimes people say, oh, well, the conservatives love Benedict and the liberals love Francis. I think Benedict is one of the great popes in this century. I think he's one of the great men, because I think he knew that Bergoglio was likely to win this election. I think he chose to resign to show that a pope could resign. I think he's an incredibly holy and prayerful man, and I think, so that's totally off the subject, but I just want to say that. This is what he writes. This is what he says in an interview. When someone asks him about, teaching in the church, he says, the church preaches what it believes is best for people. Somebody was saying, well, what about all the teaching about sexual morality? What will make them the most complete, the happiness? But a degrading reductionism often occurs. Let me explain. The most important thing about a sermon is the message of Jesus Christ, which in theology is known as the kerygma. It summarizes the core of Christian tenets, that God is in Jesus. He made himself man in order to save us. He lived in the world like one of us. He suffered, he died, he was buried, and he came back to life. This is the kerygma, the message of Christ which causes astonishment and leads to contemplation and belief. Some people believe straight away, such as Mary Magdalene. Others believe after a period of doubt, and others need to put their finger in the wound like Thomas. Each individual has his own way of coming to believe. Faith is the encounter with Jesus Christ. I see it, and this is a little farther on, I see it the degradation of the religious message in the fact that these people, certain, as he calls them, certain enlightened Christian elites, don't pay attention to the kerygma, but instead move straight to the catechism, preferably to the section on morality. And within that morality, people prefer to talk about sexual morality, about anything that has some link to sex. The fact that you're allowed to do this but not allowed to do that. The idea that someone is to blame and that someone else isn't to blame. In doing this, we relegate the treasure of the living Christ, the treasure of the Holy Spirit in our hearts, the treasure of a Christian life, which has so many other implications beyond the questions of a sexual nature, to being of secondary importance. So right away you see that what Francis is saying is that he is a man of the kerygma, of the big message, not of the catechism, of the idea that Christ came into the world and saves us. This, I think, is his first image of the church, the first kind of conversation about the church. He's not trying to say that there are no moral codes and there are no moral laws. He's saying we have to put things in their right order. Again, all of you who've done any of the Ignatian stuff, you know that Ignatius' big thing is disordered affections. It's very rarely a argument between good and bad. It's about how do you order various goods. That's what discernment is about. That's why we're supposed to be doing it all the time. The second point I want to make, the second quote I want to use, I promised you'll have a break in a minute, is in his interview with America Magazine and the other Jesuit magazines. I've got this really long quote that I've just highlighted the short part that I want, but the whole thing is great. And this is talking about the church as field hospital. I think if you read the thing, you can't miss this. And this is the notion of community. If that first one was sort of the church needs to be in conversation, we need to be discerning, we need to figure out what the teaching of Christ is. Here's the second one, is the church as a community. Quote, "This church with which we should be thinking is the home of all, not a small chapel that can hold only a small group of selected people. We must not reduce the bosom of the universal church to a nest protecting our mediocrity. And the church is mother. The church is fruitful. It must be. You see, when I perceive negative behaviors in ministers of the church or in consecrated men or women, the first thing that comes to mind is, here is an unfruitful bachelor, or here's a spinster. They are neither fathers nor mothers in the sense that they have not been able to give spiritual life." A little further on he goes, "I see clearly that the thing the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds. Heal the wounds. And you have to start from the ground up." It goes on. I'm going to stop there. Just the last line. "In pastoral ministry, we must accompany people. We must heal their wounds." Here is a very different model of the church, of the role of priests and religious and ministers, that our role is to be not judges, not figuring out what the rules are and plugging them in, but to be, in fact, accompanists, to be people who walk with others. It is over and over again, he uses this image. If you've never seen the crucifix that he wears, it is a crucifix with, in the center of the crucifix is Jesus carrying the sheep, the good shepherd. And, he said to bishops, a shepherd should smell of his sheep, should smell of the sheep. He is decidedly anti-clerical, is the thing he attacks most. He's talked to bishops saying, do not be airport bishops, always flying off to figure out how you can rise in the program. Just be where you are. And this is a model of church. It is a model of saying that you are betrothed to the community in which you live. And this is a model of leadership which is not above people, but is with people. You may have a different office, but you have a single community, a single communion. The last thing I want to talk about is just the church, and I didn't have time to type this one up because I've been reading this. The church as communion. He goes back over and over again, I think we've all heard this, back to the poor. His first trip out of Rome is to go and to dress in purple and to lay a wreath in the waters where the immigrants coming from northern Africa had died, sneaking into Europe. He causes great consternation among the people who had been beating their breasts as the great Catholic party, the far right in Italy. And yet this is the first thing he does, dressed in purple. He does penance for the whole notion of the globalization of indifference. This is what he does. And when he writes this book, Evangelii Gaudium, one of the first things he says in paragraph 46, a church which goes forth is a church whose doors are open. Going out to others in order to reach the fringes of humanity does not mean rushing out aimlessly into the world. Often it is better simply to slow down, to put aside our eagerness in order to see and listen to others, to stop rushing from one thing to another and to remain with someone who has faltered along the way. At times we have to be like the father of the prodigal son, who always keeps his door open so that when the son returns, he can readily pass through it. And then he says, I prefer a church, this is a little farther on, he goes, I'm sorry, this passage here it is. Today and always, the poor are the privileged recipients of the gospel. And the fact that it is freely preached to them is a sign of the kingdom that Jesus came to establish. We have to state without mincing words that there is an inseparable bond between our faith and the poor. We may never abandon them. Let us go forth then, let us go forth to offer everyone the life of Jesus Christ. Here I repeat for the entire church what I said to the priests and laity of Buenos Aires. I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. I do not want a church concerned with being at the center and then ends up being caught in a web of obsessions and procedures. If something should rightly disturb us and trouble our consciences, it is the fact that so many of our brothers and sisters are living without the strength, light, and consolation born of friendship with Jesus Christ, without a community of faith to support them, without meaning and a goal in life. More than by fear of going astray, my hope is that we will be moved by a fear of remaining shut up within structures which give us a false sense of security, within rules which make us harsh judges, within habits which make us feel safe, while at our door people are starving. And Jesus does not tire of saying to us, give them something to eat. For Francis then, the heart of the church is in the poor. It is the fundamental call of all of us to go out to the poor, to go out to those who are on the margins of society. And without denying any of the precepts in the catechism, what he's saying is, if we put our minds in the first place, if we follow what is first as a church, if we have this communion with the poor, then our dialogues, our conversations, our discernments will be shaped by what is fundamental and will be much healthier and stronger. The problem is that we have started at the end and tried to find the front, and that can never work. That's where I am. Let's take a little break. Why don't we take 10 minutes and come back and have questions.